A US president says his country may run another nation for years, not behind closed doors, not as a leak, but openly, calmly, almost casually. That nation is Venezuela, oil-rich, broken, exhausted by years of mismanagement and sanctions. And now, after a US raid that removed Nicolás Maduro, Washington is no longer just influencing events. It is overseeing them. I'm not here to shock you. I'm here to slow this moment down. Because moments like this, when power, resources, and rebuilding collide, tend to reshape history in ways we don't notice until it's too late. President Trump says, "Only time will tell." That phrase should make you pause. If you care about how power actually works in the modern world, not in slogans, but in systems, stay with me. Share this conversation if it makes you uncomfortable. That discomfort matters. Because before we ask what happens next, we need to understand what just happened and why. Let me be very precise about what this moment represents. This is not simply a regime change, and it is not yet a transition to democracy. What the United States has done in Venezuela is something far more ambiguous and far more consequential. It has removed a sitting leader by force, recognized an interim government rooted in the same power structure, and asserted long-term control over the country's most valuable asset, oil. Notice what is missing. There is no timeline for elections, no clear roadmap for sovereignty, no explanation for why Delcy Rodriguez, a Maduro loyalist, is now the recognized authority, while the opposition figures who won the popular vote remain sidelined, exiled, or in hiding. Instead, we hear different language: control, oversight, leverage, reconstruction, profitability. These words matter because they tell us how Washington is thinking not in moral terms, but in strategic ones. And that raises the central question of this entire story. Is Venezuela being liberated or reorganized? To answer that, we have to step back, away from personalities, away from today's headlines. We need to understand how Venezuela arrived at a point where foreign control could be presented as stability and why oil sits at the center of every decision being made now. To understand this moment, we have to rewind not months, but decades. Venezuela's collapse did not begin with Nicolás Maduro. It began with a system built almost entirely on oil. For years, oil revenue funded the state, subsidized daily life, and masked deep structural weakness. When prices were high, the system looked stable. When they fell, everything cracked. Mismanagement hollowed out institutions. Politics replaced competence. And over time, the oil industry itself, once one of the most sophisticated in the world, began to fail. Then came sanctions. Intended as pressure, they also accelerated decline. Production plummeted. Infrastructure decayed. The economy shrank. Ordinary Venezuelans paid the price. This is the cycle that matters. A resource-rich state becomes dependent. Dependency breeds fragility. Fragility invites external leverage. By the time Maduro was removed, Venezuela was no longer just weak. It was governable from the outside. That is why oil is now central again, not as a national lifeline, but as a strategic instrument. Control oil, and you shape the state. And once that logic takes hold, political change no longer arrives quietly. It arrives through rupture. That rupture is what we need to examine next. The rupture came suddenly and decisively. A US raid, Nicolás Maduro seized, a government removed not by ballots, but by force. This was the first real shock to the system. Not because Maduro fell, many expected that day would come, but because of what followed. Within days, Washington signaled that it would run Venezuela's oil sales indefinitely. Not temporarily, not conditionally, indefinitely. And then came the language that revealed everything. President Trump spoke not of transition, but of taking oil, of rebuilding the country in a very profitable way. This was not humanitarian rhetoric. It was transactional power. At the same time, an interim government led by Delcy Rodriguez, a figure rooted in the old regime, was recognized. Elections, undecided. Political prisoners, unmentioned. Legitimacy, deferred. If this feels confusing, that's because it is meant to be orderly, not democratic. And here's the uncomfortable truth. When control over resources precedes control over institutions, the crisis doesn't end. It mutates. If you're trying to understand why this moment feels different from past interventions, pause here. Share this if you sense the contradiction forming. Because the real story isn't the raid. It's the system being assembled behind it. What we are seeing now is the mechanism beneath the headlines. Power is no longer being exercised through ideology or promises of reform. It is being exercised through leverage. Oil sits at the center of that mechanism. By controlling Venezuela's oil sales, the United States doesn't just influence revenue, it shapes decisions, budgets, alliance, survival. This is why sanctions, seizures, and oversight are so effective and so dangerous. They create a government that can function only with external approval. Listen carefully to the structure being built. An interim leadership that remains in place, a foreign power that controls exports, an economy promised reconstruction, but only through compliance. This is not occupation in the old sense. There are no flags raised, no governors appointed. Instead, there is dependency engineered at the core of the state. And once dependency replaces sovereignty, elections become secondary. Institutions become optional. Legitimacy becomes negotiable. The system doesn't announce itself as domination. It presents itself as stability. But stability without self-rule is fragile. And history tells us what happens when a nation is rebuilt without being restored. That tension between control and consent is now tightening, and it's about to surface again. Now let's talk about you and about ordinary Venezuelans caught inside this system. Because while governments negotiate oil contracts and power structures, daily life doesn't pause. You don't live inside leverage. You live inside prices, shortages, fear, and waiting. More than 800 political prisoners remain behind bars. Families wait for names on lists that don't come. Exiles watch their country from afar, unsure whether returning means hope or danger. You were told this intervention was about freedom. But freedom, so far, has come without release. Without elections, without clarity. Instead, there is uncertainty dressed up as order. And here's the quiet cruelty of moments like this. When power shifts at the top but not in the system, people are asked to be patient again, to trust again, to endure again. If you feel conflicted watching this unfold, that's not confusion, that's moral awareness. Because rebuilding a country without restoring dignity leaves wounds that no amount of oil revenue can heal. If this story feels personal, share it. Because voices matter most when systems try to move without them. And what's happening in Venezuela doesn't stop at its borders. What happens in Venezuela never stays in Venezuela. The moment the United States asserted long-term control over oil sales, this stopped being a regional story. It became a global signal to allies. It says this: strategic resources can justify indefinite oversight. To rivals, it says power is still exercised through control of supply, not speeches about rules. And to energy markets, it introduces a new uncertainty, one of politics embedded directly into production. Venezuela holds the world's largest proven oil reserves. Who controls how that oil is sold, to whom, and under what conditions, reshapes leverage far beyond Caracas. It affects prices, alignments, and the behavior of other resource-rich states watching closely. There is also a geopolitical echo here. If intervention leads not to elections but to managed dependency, others will draw lessons. Some will seek protection. Others will harden defenses. Few will trust rhetoric without guarantees. This is how global norms erode, not through collapse, but through precedent. And once precedent is set, it travels fast. The question now is not whether Venezuela will change. It already has. The question is what kind of future this model produces, and whether it becomes an exception or a template. To answer that, we have to look ahead. When I look ahead, I see three possible futures, not predictions, but paths shaped by choices already underway. The first is the best case scenario. Control over oil becomes temporary. Political prisoners are released. Elections are scheduled, monitored, and respected. External leverage is used to dismantle the old regime, not preserve it. In this version, oversight fades as sovereignty returns. It is difficult, but it is possible. The second path is managed stagnation. Oil flows, revenue returns, but power remains concentrated. An interim government becomes permanent in all but name. Stability exists without accountability. The country functions, but it does not heal. Then there is the worst case scenario. Indefinite control hardens. Legitimacy never materializes. Opposition fractures. Resentment grows quietly until it erupts again, not as politics, but as chaos. History teaches us something uncomfortable here. Systems built on leverage rarely collapse quickly. They decay slowly, and by the time collapse comes, the damage is already done. Which future emerges depends less on oil than on restraint, less on power than on humility. And that brings us to the final question this moment demands. Let me leave you with the insight that matters most. Power is easy to seize, control is easy to justify, but legitimacy, real legitimacy, is the hardest thing to build. What is unfolding in Venezuela is not just a test of American power. It is a test of whether modern interventions can escape an old trap, confusing order with justice and stability with freedom. President Trump says the U.S. will rebuild Venezuela in a profitable way. That sentence captures the tension of our era. When rebuilding is framed as extraction, trust evaporates. And without trust, no transition lasts. The fate of Venezuela will not be decided by oil wells or military raids. It will be decided by whether power knows when to step back and whether the voices of Venezuelans are finally allowed to step forward. If this analysis changed how you see global power, don't keep it to yourself. Share it, talk about it, question it. Because the future of Venezuela is not just their story. It's a preview of how power may be exercised or restrained in the years ahead. And that is a story we all need to understand.